Yes.
Pleasure, Ian.
How are you today?
Fine, yes, I am. Looking forward to a conference on Saturday, and hopefully we'll have a good debate and good discussion. And then I'm looking forward to having a wee break with Gail and Gabriel. We're hoping to go down to a caravan at the weekend, next weekend. So Stranraer, here we come.
One of the local hotspots, I suppose.
Well, I hope it's hot. It's supposed to get Northern Ireland's weather apparently, so let's hope it's hot.
Fingers crossed. Now, I generally ask guests to introduce themselves at the start of the podcast. I think most folk listening to this are going to have a vague or clear picture of who you are. Can I be more specific than that and just ask what the roles that you're holding at the moment are with regards to political organisations?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I suppose people of a certain age will know who I am. I'm not so sure a lot of the new kids in the block might not know who I am, but certainly if you're around 40, 50, 60, I've been around for 30 years in Scottish politics, so I suppose they would know. I'm the co-convener of Solidarity, and that's the conference that I was referring to earlier. That's what we've got on Saturday at the Pearce Institute in Govan, and I'm also one of the co-organisers of Hope Over Fear.
Okay.
I'm not on their committee, but I help to organise the Hope Over Fear events, and we've got a big one coming up on the 19th of September, which is 1 year on, we're still yes. So I'm hoping everybody will get to Freedom Square 12 o'clock, 19th of September, and show the world that we may have lost this time, but we're going to win the next one.
It's quite an interesting thing, this Hope Over Fear. You talk about it like it's an organisation, but I'm not clear really what the nature of that organisation is. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how it's set up and what its purpose is?
Sure. Hope Over Fear was born from the desire to try and promote a different, more radical version of independence. The Yes campaign, the official Yes campaign, was established, let's say, by people with nice shirts and ties to promote the official Yes message. And Solidarity as a party wanted to be part of the Yes campaign because we signed up for it. When we approached Yes officially in Glasgow to ask to be invited to the Yes meetings, we were told that that boat had sailed and that there was no room at the inn, and we weren't very welcome. Then what transpired was I was invited to speak at a meeting away back in January of 2014 up in Fife by Yes Fife, and I had agreed to speak at this meeting in Kirkcaldy, and the organiser, Marie Penman, contacted me a couple of weeks after I had accepted the invitation to say, listen Tommy, I'm awful sorry, but the Yes campaign has intimated that if you are the speaker, then it can't be a Yes meeting.
Okay.
And I said, oh look, I'm awful sorry about that, no problem, I can understand if you want to withdraw the invitation and go ahead with the meeting and have someone else speaking. And she said, no, on the contrary, we want to change the nature of the meeting to an evening with Tommy Sheridan rather than a Yes meeting. So that took place in January of 2014 in the St Bridie's Church up in Kirkcaldy. Over 300 people turned up, and that was a meeting that was recorded, properly, professionally recorded and put on Facebook. I think it's now got about 200,000 hits on it, so it's been quite a popular meeting. And from that meeting, it became clear that if I wasn't going to be able to speak about the radical socialist form of independence that I would like to see Scotland grow into, then I was going to have to promote it via another vehicle. The Yes official campaign, apparently the tent wasn't big enough for me in it, so we decided to set up a speaking tour.
Okay.
And call it Hope Over Fear.
Okay.
And that's where Hope Over Fear was born. However, as the tour developed, I spoke at 110 meetings across Scotland, thousands upon thousands of people turning up, and it became clear that we really had to try and formalise this. It couldn't just become Tommy Sheridan Hope Over Fear, it had to become an organisation. So in order to organise the 12th October big demonstration in George Square last year. Hope Over Fear formalised and a committee was formed. I took a step back from that because I'm quite a controversial character, and I thought, well, I don't want Hope Over Fear as an organisation to have to be burdened by me, so I let all the new people that had became involved run it, and took a step back, and that's how Hope Over Fear was born as an organisation. They organised 12th October, then they organised another demonstration there in April to promote lending your vote to the SNP for the general election, and again thousands and thousands took part in that, and it was hugely successful. So that's the sort of a genesis of Hope Over Fear. Grew organically into something that was much bigger than me. I was only the person that laid the seed, and the seed itself grew.
Okay. We'll circle back around to 2015 later in our chat. I want to do something I do with all my guests and go back to when you can first remember getting involved, well, not even getting involved in politics, being around politics. Did you grow up with politics around you?
Ian, my political history is related to my mother.
Okay.
My mother Alice is a huge influence on me. Most people, I think, would accept that their parents are big influences in their life, but politically, my mother left school without any qualifications, 15 years of age, as they did in those days. Worked in pubs most of her life, worked as a cleaner, but my mum was quite a clever cookie, and while she was working in pubs she started to get involved with the Transport and General Workers Union. She started trying to get the staff organised. Things like the staff invariably were getting asked to work longer hours than they'd been contracted to, because once people had left the pub there had a lot of cleaning up to do. Staff were having to get taxis home out their own wages because they were too late for public transport. Things that needed addressed within the bar trade. So my mum became a member of the TGW and then became an organiser for the TGW within the bar trade. And my mum, quite proudly in the mid-70s, led the first strike against tenant Caledonian brewers, who at that time refused to recognise trade unions. They said, oh, it's a transitory workforce, a very temporary workforce, we're not going to recognise trade unions. And my mum organised a strike among the bar trade staff of the tenant Caledonian pubs, and people laughed because they said, oh, for God's sake, how can you have a strike in pubs? People will just go to a different pub. If one pub's shut, they'll just go to a different pub. What my mum did, however, was she organised a picket of the brewery itself, and in those days everybody that was driving the tankers were on the union. The strike lasted 2 days and Tenant Caledonian collapsed and agreed to recognise the trade unions. So that's the type of background that I've been brought up in, because this was all happening while my mum was out working and telling all these stories. Then she got very involved with what was known in those days as the Battered Wives movement. It's now known as Women's Aid, but my mum was very influential in getting the TGW to back the Battered Wives movement. My mum used to get phone calls during the night from irate and upset wives who were being abused at home, and my mum was being asked to go and help them. And it became apparent that one of the biggest problems was when people would say, you know, these women, why are they staying in the house, why don't they leave? The problem was they didn't know where to go. So what was required was refuges to be built, and in particular the TGWU was persuaded via a long campaign to put their weight and their money behind the building of a refuge so that battered wives had somewhere to go. And I remember as a wee kid growing up with this, and I was always dead frightened because my mum was going to houses where a wife was getting beat up and my mum was going to help them, and as a wee boy I used to be dead frightened. But my mother, she just had no fear. She just, it needed to be done, and she went and did it. And that is a sense of right and wrong, justice, injustice that I was brought up with all my life. I remember a specific story when I was 8 years of age, sitting in my mum's lap I'd set all my wee sojies out in the living room in the house, my German sojies and my British sojies, and I'd had them all set out, and I was looking forward to playing with my sojies, and then the lights went out. It was near light, and my mum brought in candles, wood candles, and my mum explained to me why the lights went out, and she told me about these miners and how they'd went away deep underground to dig for coal, and how they brought up this coal, and this coal was turned into electricity, and that's what gave us light, and these miners were getting paid a very bad wage, and it was a very unsafe industry, and that's why they were striking. Now, I'll be absolutely honest with you, I can remember 8 years of age, not really being bothered about the miners. I just wanted to play with my sojies, and I couldn't get playing with them. But do you know what? The fact that I can recall that story so vividly shows you the effect it has on you as a youngster. And I now meet people at things like Friends Reunited events who'll tell me that in the modern studies class I was always arguing against the teachers and arguing against anybody being disciplined for not doing their homework and all that. Now, I can't even remember these arguments. So my politics came from my mother. There's no doubt about that. Her sense of injustice, her sense of right and wrong. I don't know if I've yet got my mum's courage. I'd certainly love to one day have the courage of my mother, but certainly my politics was forged on my mother's lap, her telling me the stories of the miners and her fighting the battles of the TGWU and her fighting for battered wives.
So with these values instilled from an early age, at what point did you become active politically yourself, would you say?
I would say I was around 16 when I was doing my modern studies special project, and I had chosen the troops in Northern Ireland and the Troops Out movement, and I, for the purposes of this project, I had to write to some of the main players in Northern Irish politics in those days. So I had to write to Gerry Adams, I had to write to Gerry Fitt, I had to write to Ian Paisley, and I developed a modern studies presentation on the basis that the British troops were occupying illegally Northern Ireland. Now, obviously at the time they would argue that it wasn't illegal because it was the British government that sanctioned it, but obviously the Irish Republican Army were arguing that it was a war, and there were two sides to the argument, and that probably was the first time that I really became aware of politics and conflict. As a youngster, you know, we used to have a bit of debate in our house because my sister, my eldest sister Lynn, she joined the army, and I remember 16 years age doing this modern studies project. My sister had joined the army, and we used to have really intense arguments about what was happening in Northern Ireland and whether it was actually a war or was it terrorism. The British government, it was terrorism. The Irish supporters of the IRA, it was a war, and I became aware then of the difference of opinion and diversity of debate, and obviously right in my own house, because my sister was a member of the British Army. Therefore, was it right for the IRA to attack the army? Was that terrorism or was that a war? So 16 years of age when I became aware of that, and I think like most 16-year-olds, everything was black and white. There was a right and a wrong, nothing was grey.
Sure.
I remember saying to my sister, I'm going to go and join the IRA. Probably would have rejected me as a fearty anyway, but I think when you're young you have a much more simplistic view of life, and you get older and you realise that things are a wee bit more complicated, and that there are several sides to a story, not just two. That there are usually just two to begin with, and then 3, 4 and 5 sides to a story. But that was probably my first introduction. Then when I was 17, I had been shipped off to Stirling University. When I was 16, I wanted to leave school. I wanted to be a mechanic or a firefighter. That was my two jobs that I wanted to be. And my mum had always said, no son, stick in at school, do your hires, go to university. And I didn't have a clue why I was going to university, but she used to say to me, she'd say, I want to change the system, Mum, I want to change the system. And she used to say, son, before you can change the system, you need to learn how it works. Go and learn how it works, then you'll be able to change the system. So this was the whole idea of going to university. I got accepted at Glasgow, I got accepted at Strathclyde, and I got accepted at Stirling. That was the three that I'd applied for. And my mum encouraged me to go to Stirling, because she said, look, part of university is learning about life, and if you stay here and go to Glasgow or Strathclyde, you'll have loads of distractions, because my mates always wanted to go out and play football. Sure. And chase after women and all that type of stuff that you do as a 16 and 17 year old. If you go and live on your own at Stirling University as a 17 year old, you're going to have to learn about life. So that's what happened, and I joined the Labour Club immediately. My mum by this time had joined the Labour Party. I joined the Labour Club and the Labour Party in Stirling, went along to meetings of the Labour Club, Stirling University Labour Club, and discovered people selling the militant newspaper. Right. People like Hazel Sutherland, and Davy Brown, who I remember both of them fondly, a guy called Eddie Donicky as well. And these guys were selling this newspaper. I bought the newspaper, read the newspaper, loved the stuff I was reading in this newspaper, and these guys were working class. And one of the things about going to university, Stirling, coming from Pollock, was you felt out your comfort zone. I remember sitting in one of my first tutorials, sociology tutorial, and we were discussing the causes and effects of unemployment, and we went round, there was about 8 or 9 in the room, and we were going round the room asking people what their views were, the causes and effects of unemployment. And one of the arguments I gave was that being on the dole often led to a loss of identity. Most people in those days, and still happens today, but most people, when you start talking in a pub or an event, what do? Oh, I'm a joiner, I'm a plumber, I'm an electrician, I'm a driver, I'm a bus driver, whatever. You often relate to other people by your job. Okay. And if you're unemployed, you don't have a job, and it's a sort of a loss of identity. And I made these points in my contribution, and the next person to talk was from Kent, and they said, excuse me, what's the dole? And it suddenly became apparent that they didn't even know what I was talking about when I mentioned the dole, because unemployment in those days, this was 1981, it had only started to come in a mass scale, and in some parts of England still hadn't been scarred by it. And it suddenly became apparent to me that I was way out of my comfort zone here. Stirling in those days was supposed to be one of the universities with the highest proportion of working class people. I'll tell you what, if that was the highest proportion, I'm glad I wasn't at one of the ones with the lowest proportion, because there was an awful lot of middle class people there. So that's a roundabout way of saying that I automatically gravitated towards those that were selling the militant newspaper because of their working class roots, and from that became very interested in the whole idea of Marx and Marxism. Done a hell of a lot of reading. I suppose I was frightened even when I was at university. I was only 17. I was the first one in my family to go to university. I was the first one in my street, Linthall Road in Pollock, my wee bit of street. Everybody was like, oh, he's going to university, It was something weird going to university. And I had this fear of failing. I didn't want to fail. So I studied an awful lot. I read an awful lot. Particularly read an awful lot of politics books. Interestingly enough, Ralph Miliband was one of my favourite authors, father of Ed, and by the way, great writer, fantastic stuff. Pity his boy didn't read his books, because he may have become a better politician. But read a lot of Ralph Miliband, and who considered himself a Marxist, and then I read an awful lot of Marx as well. And university was a bit like opening the curtains to me in terms of life, because I thought I knew a lot about life and realised I knew nothing about life, and university opened doors and opened the curtains and taught me a lot more because of the books that I was encouraged to read. So that became very, very political, and then by 82, 83, you're looking at the Stockport Messenger struggle, you're looking at NGA, You're looking at the Eddie Shah. You're looking at the militarisation of the police force against that dispute. And then by 84, I'm in my final year. I'm doing my dissertation in Marx's labour theory of value, and I'm involved in the miners' strike. And my proudest ever role that I was elected to be was the picket bus organiser for Stirling University, and we used to travel into the miners' welfare at 5 in the morning to go on the picket buses to go to Castle Hill and Castle Bridge and be involved in the strike. And after a few weeks, the miners sent the bus up to the university to pick us all up, because there was so many of us regularly going to the picket lines, and that was your biggest introduction to politics. That was a civil war without bullets. That showed you the nature of capitalist society. The miners' strike was the best education you could ever have. Vladimir Lenin once wrote that an ounce of experience is worth a ton of theory. Well, the miners' strike was that ounce of experience which opened your eyes to just the nature of capitalism.
Of course, after that, you took on some more prominent activist roles. You became almost notorious in certain areas of the media. Can you tell me a little bit about what followed in the 80s into the 90s in terms of activism for you, and how your views developed over that period?
Well, as I said, during the university years, it was a great privilege to meet with and campaign side alongside people like Pat Gavin, Tam McGeoch, who were miners for Stirling, and learn about that struggle firsthand, rather than read about it. Relate those stories to what my mother had told me about, and I became convinced that I wanted to be a revolutionary. I had discovered John Maclean in the course of my university days, and I was dead angry because I was reading about this guy who was born in Pollokshaws, which isn't that far from where I was brought up in Pollock. I was reading about this guy who was a revolutionary in the interwar period, who was denigrated and imprisoned 5 times in his life for opposing the First World War and the carnage of the First World War, who was involved in trying to organise the Clyde workers in the shipyards and the engineering firms, who had tried to support and organise the rent strikes against the landlords that were profiteering from the First World War and putting up their rents because of the demand for private homes in Glasgow. And I was reading about this guy, and I'd never heard about him. I'd went through school never hearing about John Maclean, and now I'm reading about this guy who lived just along the road phase, was involved in some of the most momentous events in Glasgow's history, the Red Clydeside era, the rent strikes, Bloody Friday of 1919, when the troops were sent from England and Glasgow was under martial law for 3 days, and the troops in the Maryhill barracks were locked up, and the guns were locked up, and they had to bring troops from England overnight to quell the strike, to prevent what they thought was a revolution in 1919. And I'm saying to myself, wait a minute, why have I never heard about this? I've went through Lourdes Secondary School, which is supposedly quite a good school. I went there for 5 years, and I hadn't heard about John Maclean or the Red Clydeside or Davy Kirkwood or Willie Gallagher, and I was so angry, and it made me realise just how much of our history was hidden from us. And I became a very enthusiastic follower of the Maclean's ideas, Scottish Workers' Republic, the idea that Scotland could stand on its own 2 feet, the idea of socialism itself, the idea of internationalism, the idea of a brotherhood and a sisterhood of the world. So Maclean had a big influence on us, and he was a revolutionary. I wanted to be a revolutionary, and obviously 21 years of age, some people were wanting to be merchant bankers and use their degrees. I got a 2-1 at Stirling Uni. I got a joint honours, economics and politics, and people were saying, oh, you should put it to better use and get a good job and all the rest of it. But from my point of view, I wanted to be involved in politics. I returned back to Pollock in 1985-86. Got right into the Labour Party, organising the Labour Party, was involved in a lot of the local campaigns. I remember one of my first experiences, Ian, there was a wee kid had been knocked down in Line Cross Road in Pollock, and it was a very, very busy road, and the cars were speeding an awful lot, and we'd been campaigning for speed bumps for ages, and the council wasn't listening. So we organised a group of us to sit in the road and basically block the road, which is what we did. And we got arrested. I always remember getting arrested by the police, but I got shoved into the van with an old socialist called Jack Sheridan, who's no longer with us, rest his soul. And I remember getting flung into the back of the van, and there was about 8 or 9 years to get flung into the back of this van by the police. And Jack said, "Are you sure this is the bingo bus?" And it just lightened the mood that we were all getting arrested for being on the road, but Jack just lightened the load and made light of the fact that we were being arrested. And the truth is, it wasn't nice being arrested, but you know what? Within a couple of months we got road bumps on the road, and we never get any more kids knocked down in that particular stretch of the road. So early doors, it was quite clear to me that there was a role for civil disobedience. Okay. As I said, I used to read them at Maclean and the rent strikes and how they civilly disobeyed, and they stopped the sheriff officers who were sent out to try and evict the mothers and the daughters that were living in houses that they couldn't afford any longer, because while the brothers and husbands were away fighting in the First World War, the private landlords were increasing the rents and trying to profiteer out it. So that taught me a lesson that paid me well when it came to the poll tax struggle, because the poll tax, we started learning about it around about 1988, and here was this tax that was going to be imposed on people at a flat rate, and it was going to replace the old rate system. The old rate system, very, very few people ever cared about the rates. Most people couldn't tell you how much they paid in rates, because they would go to the rent office and they'd pay the rent and rates together, and they'd tell you what the rent was, but they didn't know what the rates was, because it was a small part of the bill. However, if you lived in a big house, your rates was quite substantial, or was bigger, and the Tories didn't like the rates, and the Tories in Scotland in particular didn't like the rates. So by 1988 they came up with this community charge that was going to change the rates and introduce this community charge, and of course everybody was going to have a flat rate, so the people in the big houses were going to pay less and the people in the tenement buildings were going to pay more. And in actual fact, if you were a duke in a castle, you'd be paying the same or less than a dustman in a council house. It was an absolute disgrace. And if you had 4 or 5 adults in a house, which lots of council houses had, each of them were going to be paying a poll tax bill compared to a household rates bill. So it was a disaster. It was a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. It was Robin Hood in reverse. And people like myself and others got together and said, no, we're not having this. We're going to rebel. We tried to argue against the poll tax, and the 1987 election, Mrs Thatcher made it her flagship policy. She got gubbed in Scotland, but she won in England. Well, familiar story. And what happened was, by 1988, we were beginning to have public meetings everywhere, because it was due to be introduced in 1989. 31st of March 1989 was the introduction day, 1st of April 1989. We organised a massive big demo the 31st of March of 1989, and by that time people had tried things like frustrating the registration for the poll tax. There was this thing called the Stop It campaign, which the Labour Party and some of the trade unions were involved in, and it became clear that it was a distraction, because Thatcher couldn't give a damn. You could write all the letters you wanted, you could sign all the petitions you wanted. She couldn't give a damn. She was implementing it. We were the guinea pigs. We were getting it a year before.